Here we go. Buckle up. We ended last week reading Genesis 1 down through Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4. And when we look at this section in Genesis 1 and beginning of chapter 2, in Hebrew writing, this is a poem. It is Hebraic poetry. And the way that it's constructed, the way that it's put together is all significant when it comes to this Hebraic poetry. And as we're looking in this series of lessons of how would the Hebrews 3,500 years ago, when this was written for the very first time and read to them for the very first time, how would they have heard it? What, by the way that they process writings like this, what would they have gained from it? As they took it and studied it and analyzed it, what would they have gained from it? And it's different than what you and I, in a Western culture, what we see. And so we're trying to combine the two hands, the left hand and the right hand playing the piano, and adding them together to make it a more full and vibrant and a better way of understanding what God has done here. And it's really quite amazing. I'm going to start with a question this morning. When we read through Genesis 1, and I think we read through Genesis 2 and verse 4, what is the final conclusion of this poem? What does it end with? What? I heard it, I think. Okay. It was good. What else? I thought I heard. Okay, it was very good. And that is significant at the end. What does God do at the end? It ends with rest. And that is going to be something significant that we're going to come back to. Just kind of hold on to that for a minute, and we're going to come back to that. What I want to show you is something that when I first started studying this and hearing this and the way that these things are constructed and everything, I was a little skeptical. And until I started studying it further, and I began to see how often these things happen in the text, in these old Hebrew writings, and they're pretty incredible. I mentioned it right at the very end of class last week, this word chiasm. Anybody do any looking up of what a chiasm is? Anybody know what a chiasm is? What is a chiasm? Okay, say it again. Learning it backwards and forwards. Okay, that's where we get that word of a chasm, but it's learning something backward and forward. That's a good way to define it. That's a better definition than I've got. And so it's a literary device that writers use to repeat ideas, and they do it in ascending order and then descending order. So going forward, and then you go through it backward. And when I show you this first one, you'll probably be skeptical too, because when you start seeing it, you're like, oh, it's just coincidence. It just happened to be like that. But I promise you, when you see how often these chiasms appear in Hebrew literature, you begin to realize this is no coincidence. They're here by design. They are intentionally put here by God for a specific purpose. So sometimes as you go through a story, Hebrew writing, a poem, Hebrew poetry, a chiasm, it'll appear in one of two different patterns. This is, to try to simplify it, this is the first pattern that you'll see sometimes. So this is learning it forward and then backward. So it might be words that are used, it might be a phrase that's used, it might be numbers that are used. But you'll see it appear in the text. And you'll see point A, point B, point C, point D, and then the writer will go through it backwards. He'll repeat point D, and then C, and then B, and then A. And you'll see that as a pattern in the way that they would write. Sometimes it appears like this, where you'll have point A, B, C, and D, and then it'll repeat again, and you'll see point A, B, C, and D again. And it's really interesting, again, as you're seeing it in the text and how it's designed in the pattern and how everything is put in together to do that. And so if we look at this poem in Genesis 1 as this Mesopotamian Eastern style poem, a certain pattern begins to appear. Let's go back and think about the first 3 days of creation. When we look at the first 3 days of creation, we notice that all 3 days have something in common. Now, this is something I'd never seen before. I'd never thought of it like this before because Western thinkers, we don't think in pictures. We don't see the picture of the text. We see the definitions and all the details. And so if you look at it from a 10,000-foot perspective, looking at it, something else starts to appear. The first 3 days, let's start with day 1. So in day 1 of creation, what does God do? He creates light, but in creating light, what else does he do? Okay. What's that? Light overtakes darkness. So on day 1, God is separating light and darkness. So what we actually start to see, what a Hebrew reader what they're going to see immediately is that the first 3 days are days of separation. Day 1, God separates light from darkness. What happens on day 2? He separates water from the sky. What happens on day 3? What's that? He separates the land from the water, the seas. 3 days of separation. And then we come to the next 3 days. And so we go to day 4. What does God start doing on day 4? What is day 4? Sun, moon, and stars. So God starts filling the things that he has separated. So on day 4, we see God filling the light and the darkness with the heavenly bodies, sun, moon, and stars. What does God do on day 5? Fish and birds. So he starts filling the water and the sky with the fish and the birds. What does he do on day 6? He starts filling the land and the sea with the land and sea creatures. And so what we have here is a chiasm. And to a Western thinker like us, we're going, yeah, maybe. It just kind of seems kind of coincidental that happened that way. But when you study Hebrew literature and you begin to look at the way that it's structured, this was no coincidence. This was designed this way for a reason. And so day 1 goes with day 4, day 2 goes with day 3, day 5, day 3 goes with day 6. If you folded this story up in the middle, it would fold up on itself. And that is a literary tool that Easterners use a lot in their writing. And so remember, they don't teach the way we teach. We like to teach, make a point, give supporting evidence to prove your point by using logic and reasoning and other information. And Easterners, they'll do that, but they have a fundamental belief that true learning doesn't just happen by learning information. True learning happens, they believe, and you'll hear them say this, when they learn a new truth. Now, in our culture today, that we're skeptical with statements like that because of people today saying, well, you have your truth and I have my truth. And that's not what they're talking about. They're actually talking about if you can learn something that is absolute truth, not just because you want it to be true. If you can learn a new truth of something, when you became a Christian, you learned some new truths. Things about God and Christ and his sacrifice and things like that, that they were new truths. That to them is the absolute pinnacle of learning when you learn something that is new, that is true. So what they do is they write in patterns and they give all kinds of information that you and I like, but they're looking beyond just what is said for some other truth that sometimes it's kind of hidden in the patterns, like chiasms. And when they write their stories, somewhere in that story is something the author wants you to discover. And it's not always going to be obvious on the surface. It's going to be buried in the story because an Eastern author writing to an Eastern audience is trying to lead you through a process of discovery till you come to find that truth. And again, this has created an understanding for me of I've already always believed God's word is incredible and amazing and perfect in every way. It's now taken to another level when you actually see what God is doing with the text, not just in the text, but with the text. And the design behind that, for that to be something that the way that it works it's incredible. So now we know this about Eastern thinkers. We know this is how they write. We know they use chiasms. We know they use these. We know this. Just in the real world, we know this. So doesn't it make sense that God would use that principle when he's writing to a group of Eastern people? Because that's who Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, that's what it was written to. So it makes sense. Now, an Eastern reader also is going to notice other things. Here's another chiasm, but it's a different type of chiasm. You can see it in your English text. Day one of creation is a very small paragraph. There's not a lot said about it. Day two, a little bit bigger, but it's like a medium-sized paragraph about day two. Day three is a big paragraph. There's a lot said about day three. But then in day four, there's a lot said. That's a big paragraph too. Day five is a medium-sized paragraph, and day six is a small paragraph. Now, is that significant to the message? Maybe, maybe not. But it is a pattern. And an Eastern thinker is going to notice it. And they're going to see there is a change and a pattern that's happening in the way that this poem has been written. And so, the literary structure of the size of the paragraphs, it follows that first example of a chiasm at the top. It goes little, medium, big, medium, little. So it's A, B, C, C, B, A. But the days, what we saw with the 3 days of filling, or separating and the 3 days of filling, it's the other one. It's A, B, C, A, B, C. So we see both kinds of chiasms right here in the first chapter in the way that it's constructed and put together. And now, there are other patterns that Hebrew scholars point out as well. And I'll say, are all of these patterns important and significant in an ultimate understanding of the truth that God's trying to get through in this poem that he's given? No, they're not. But as a Hebrew is studying the text, they're going to look for all of the patterns they can possibly find, and they are like little pieces of a puzzle, and they're going to start putting the pieces together, and they're going to get to the end and realize, oh, well, all of these pieces didn't even fit on this puzzle. They weren't as significant. But they're going to find all of them and then see what works together to be able to find that truth in the middle. And so here's what happens. When you go through the text, if we were Hebrew students and we're looking at the text, looking for these things, these patterns in the text. So we've seen the number 3 already. 3 days of separation, 3 days of filling. Hebrews are going to immediately think, are there any other patterns of 3 in the text? Because that seems to be significant. And so they start looking. Well, the 3 days of separation, like we said, 3 days of filling. They would probably notice the 3 parts of Elohim, God. You have God the Creator. You have God the Ruach, that we talked about last week, the Spirit. And then you also have the Word of God, that are all 3 parts that are found here in this text. So they would notice that. They also would notice words and how many times they're used. The word bara, the word for create, is used 3 times in the poem. Once at the very beginning, once in the very middle, and once at the very end. That would be very significant to them, because even the way that it appears in the text, in beginning, middle, end. And so they're just looking. Again, is that a critical piece of the puzzle? Don't know yet. But they're looking for patterns. That's how they study. Okay? They also notice that there's 7 days of creation. Is that significant? I don't know. Are there other sevens in the text? Well, they'll even dig down into some very detailed things. So they would go like, in the Hebrew language, the very first sentence of the poem has 7 words. Is that significant? Maybe not. But they still notice that. They still pull that piece out of the box. Might not go to this puzzle, but it's still something that they will look at. But they also begin to see, but there is a pattern starting to form. Because the second sentence in the poem has 14 words. 7 times 2. Is that important? I don't know. Maybe not. Might be random. But they still notice it. They would notice that the word earth occurs 21 times, 7 times 3. They would notice that the 7th sentence so the word number 7, they're going to count down to the 7th sentence. It has 35 words, a multiple of 7. Is that important? Maybe not. But it's still something they would see. The word God appears 35 times, 7 times 5. The phrase, it was so, occurs 7 times. The phrase, and God saw, occurs 7 times. So, is it important? We don't know yet. But these are the things that they're doing as they're studying and they're analyzing. And while you and I are looking in lexicons and dictionaries trying to define what Elohim and bara and all of these things are as Western thinkers, because that's how we want to study it and look at it, they are looking at it differently. And it doesn't mean that what we're doing is wrong. It doesn't mean what they're doing is wrong. But it's a different way of studying and analyzing the text. They would then, there's patterns of 3, there's patterns of 7. Could there possibly be patterns of 10? And you and I, we kind of chuckle. And we're like, this is ridiculous. Until you start to see what shows up in the text. The phrase to make appears 10 times. The phrase according to its kind appears 10 times. The phrase and God said appears 10 times. This is not a very big poem. And this is still happening in the text. When and God said appears, it just happens to be that 3 of those times are in reference to people. 7 of those times refer to creation. The phrase let there be appears 10 times. It just so happens that 3 of those times it refers to things in the heavens. 7 of those times it refers to things on earth. Is that important? Don't know yet. But it's definitely there. And a Hebrew would see it and notice it, and so it becomes very, very significant to them. So, when we see all of these things, it all sounds like crazy talk to us in Western culture because we're hardwired in our training to look at the context and to define the words and understand exactly what God's saying. And there's nothing wrong with that. God designed it for us to be able to do that. But like we said, it's the left hand playing with the right hand, taking both of those views together to help us see and understand some things maybe a little bit clearer. The question that was asked that I read, one was, we don't think like this. It seems crazy to us. But were the Eastern thinkers, the ones that God originally wrote this to, and all of the Jews and Hebrews for thousands of years, were they wrong for looking at the Old Testament scriptures in a different way? They couldn't have been. Because God wrote it to them to begin with, in a way for them to look at it like this. And again, I had to remind myself that these things were given by God to them, for them, so that maybe I might be able to gain some better insight too if I look through their lens instead of just mine. And so, will it help me gain a better understanding of the text is really what we're wanting to see. So, the Eastern mind, they're looking for some kind of a buried treasure. All of these patterns, chiasms, they're used for the purpose of pointing you to the treasure, that truth in the text. And it's not on the surface. It's something that is going to be involved with that whole pattern that's there. And so, that's where this chiasm thing reveals its importance. Because a chiasm always points to the center. The center of the chiasm is where the treasure is. And you hear me talking about bookends all the time, where, like, Romans is a great example. Romans chapter 1 and verse 5, very beginning, Paul writes about the obedience of faith. And in the very last verse of Romans, he uses the same phrase, obedience of faith. Only time he ever uses that in all of his writings, but he uses it at the very beginning of Romans, he uses it at the very end. So guess what everything in the middle of Romans is about? Obedience of faith. That's what it's about. Well, chiasms do the same thing. And once you find the beginning and the end of a chiasm, the Hebrew readers would begin working their way to the center of the chiasm to see what is it that's buried in the middle of this chiasm. So let me start with the question. In the story of Genesis 1, what did Genesis 1 start with? What did God start with in the beginning? What did God have in the beginning and start with? Your silence is actually the correct answer. What did God have? He had nothing. The poem starts with nothingness. Okay? The end of the poem, it ends in chapter 2, beginning of chapter 2. At the end of the story, what does God do? He rests. What is God resting? It's nothing. God does nothing. And again, we're looking at this how a Hebrew would see it. The beginning of this poem starts with nothingness. The end of the poem ends with nothingness, with God resting. And so they would look and say, okay, we have found the beginning and the end of a chiasm in this poem. Of everything else, we've seen other chiasms in this poem. And so they would begin to work their way to the middle. And literally, they would start counting words. They would start from the beginning, and they would start counting to the center, and they would start at the end, and they would start counting to the center, and they would count and see what is the word that's in the middle. Now, sometimes it's significant, sometimes it's not. But that is one of the first places they go, because more times than not, what's in the middle is there for a reason. So, and the Hebrew does this with Genesis 1, with this poem. The Hebrew word in the middle that they come to is the word moad. Now, being that this story is about 7 days of creation, you would think that the center of everything should be in a section about day 4. And guess what? It is. The word moad, the center of the poem, lands in the center of the days of creation. And we find that the word moad here in Genesis 1 and verse 14, in your English Bible, is the word seasons. There in chapter 1 and verse 14. The word moad is used 323 times in the Old Testament. And this is the only place that English translators translated it seasons, which is very frustrating. That's the way we've always heard it. God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. But that's the only time in all of the 323 times that it's ever translated seasons. 251 times moad is translated meeting, or this is the word that's used for tent of meeting. This is the word that the Jews used. It was one of 4 different words that the Jews used to refer to the activities that took place on the Sabbath day. So it is about Sabbath day activities. That's what this context of the tent of meeting, being with God, And the things that happen on the Sabbath day, many times they would use the word moad to describe, well, what is supposed to happen on the Sabbath day? Rest. Nothing. It begins with nothingness, it ends with God doing nothing, and the word in the middle is a word that the Jews understood to refer to nothing. Rest. So after approaching Genesis 1 through the eyes of an Eastern thinker like the Israelites were, we find the primary message, this message of the creation poem to them was all about Shabbat, Sabbath. It was about rest. Now, why would that be? Okay, once again, try in your mind, put yourself in the shoes of the Israelites who heard this for the very first time. Where were they when they heard this read the very first time? Mount Sinai. Right. So Moses has we looked at that last week. Moses has just come down with the law, and he reads it to the people. So they are at Mount Sinai. Where did they just come from? Egypt. Egyptian bondage, okay? What were they doing when they were in Egypt? Slaves. As slaves, what were they doing? They were making bricks. Tells us specifically, that was their job, making bricks. So imagine yourself as a bunch of these liberated slaves who have just walked away from your Egyptian slave masters, and for 430 years you've made bricks. Egypt has told you for centuries that your value, your worth, is tied up in the idea of how many bricks you can produce. If you can't make bricks, if you can't make very many, you're not valuable to the Egyptians. If you're not valuable to the Egyptians, they're going to eliminate you from the equation. If you get eliminated from the equation, then how are your wife and your children going to be taken care of? Well, we can probably imagine what the Egyptians would do with your wife and your children. So you see, there was a practical reality to these people, to the fact that you are only as valuable as how many bricks you can make, what you can produce. That's how they got their value. So here is how the Eastern thinker now, they're hearing Genesis 1 for the first time as freed slaves just released from Egyptian bondage. The very first lesson that God is teaching them, what they're hearing when they see this, is God saying, before we can talk about anything else, I need you to know something. I need you to know how to take a break. I need you to know and learn how to rest. Because this is going to be a break that's going to remind you of your real value, your real worth. It doesn't come from what you produce. It comes from who you are. And the Eastern thinker, they would have taken very close notice that here in the creation story, that it's only after God made man that God said his creation was what? Very good. After all the other days, he says it was good. Only after he created man does God say it's now very good. They would have noticed that. There's value that is given to man when God creates man. And so that's all in this message, in this story. And so in the creation story, why does God rest? Have you ever thought about that? Why does God rest on day 7? Does he run out of material to use? Is he tired? Does he need to take a break? Why does God rest? Okay, it's an example. It's something that they're going to see in the future, and he's going to use it in the future. But it's an example of rest, right? God is resting because there's nothing else that needs to be done. Everything he's done that needs to be done is completed. There's an illustration that one Jewish rabbi uses about Michelangelo when he carves the statue David. And to this day, artists declare that this is one of the most perfect sculptures that's ever been created. But while Michelangelo was carving it, at some point, he had to know there's nothing else that I can do. If I take one more swing of the hammer, it's going to mess up the sculpture. And so God looked at everything he created, and he said, I have done everything I can possibly do for my creation. It's exactly the way I want it to be. And it's also interesting to note that God has ended each day up to this point with the phrase, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. There was evening and there was morning the second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, the sixth day. Guess what's missing on the seventh day? He doesn't say it on the seventh day. He doesn't say there's evening and morning. The Hebrew thinker sees that. That's significant because there's something different about day 7. Day 1 had a beginning and an end. Day 2 had a beginning and an end. Day 7 never did. The message of day 7, a Hebrew thinker is looking at it going, it never ends. What God did in his creation in making it perfect is something that will last forever. And so, they see the image and they see the picture that this paints. God's deliberately hanging the seventh day out there, endlessly, emphasizing that day of rest. And so God is going to command the Israelites to observe the seventh day. We're going to see this in the book of Exodus. God's going to command the Israelites to observe the seventh day on the Sabbath day. And yes, it's a reminder that God is the God of creation and he rested on the seventh day. That is part of the truth. But after seeing how an Israelite looks at the story of creation, when God commands them to rest on the seventh day, it's more to remind them that their value is not about how much they do, but about who they are as children of God. That's what they're seeing. And so, would I be wrong in saying that our culture today is wound up in an Egyptian narrative? Because our culture, aren't we all about how much you can produce? It's all about having enough. Am I smart enough? Do I own enough? Can I impress enough of the right kind of people? It's all about how much I do. Do I have enough of the right degrees? Have I made it far enough in my career? It sounds to me like we today are slaves to a system of brick making, and we don't even realize it. We just keep producing, and we keep impressing, and we keep trying to show up to be the thing that we think we need to be. And I can only imagine that God today, he would still say the same thing. You need to learn how to stop. You need to learn how to rest. You need to know how to stop and join me, your God, in just enjoying what I have created for you. And everyone's invited to come in and to celebrate with me and accept what I have made in my creation for you and to know it's enough. What I have made is enough. There's nothing more that I could have made for you. I'm not holding out on you. When I finished creation, it was perfect. It's exactly what you needed. And I feel the same way about all of you, and even more so than I do about the rest of my creation. Because when I made you, it became very good. And so God is looking at these Israelites as they're coming out of bondage, and it's really God trying to reprogram slave mentality of what they've had and what Egypt has been drilling into their minds for hundreds of years, and God trying to say, erase all of that. That's not how I think. The way their gods are portrayed, that's not who I am. I am the one who made everything. I am the one who made you. And I just need you to trust the story. God's about to tell them the story of everything that has happened. of what God has done for them. And he starts with, the first thing I need you to do is reset your mind and understand who you are, and that your importance is not because of what you can do. And even as Christians, a lot of times we get stuck in that. We might even look around at other Christians going, I can't do it like they do it. I'm not as good at it as them as they are. And we get wrapped into this, who am I trying to impress? Well, the Apostle Paul talks about, I'm not trying to impress men. I'm trying to impress God. I'm looking to him as the one that everything I do is for him. And there's a reason why. We see elsewhere in Scripture, it tells us, be still and know that I am God. Multiple times God is going to remind us through the story, you need to stop and take a break. Stop relying on yourself and what man in the world says that you need to be. And you just need to rely on what I want you to be. And so that, again, do we see that in a Western way that we approach Genesis chapter 1? I never saw that. But if you were asked a Hebrew, those Israelites, when this was first written, to even Jews today, as they're studying the text, those are the things that they see. And now for me, did that make my understanding of Genesis 1 and what God was doing, did it make it more vibrant? Did it make it more beautiful? And does it have even more meaning? Otherwise, yeah, it's important about God being the creator and our Christian evidences and all the evidences and things like that that we like in the Western culture to go through. Yeah, that's all still there. But now we see God was doing so much more than just that. And so as we continue through the text, and we'll speed up a little bit as we continue to move through Genesis, but we're going to continue to come back to these same principles. That's why I've taken, 3 weeks to look at this first part, because all of these things that we see in chapter 1 show up again. The chiasms show up again, and we got to find the middle of the chiasm. What's the point? And we're going to be doing that as we go through the text. And so I wanted to take my time and really be able to lay a foundation for how, if we're going to approach this from a Hebrew mindset, how do you do that? Because that's not how we normally do it. Yep.
Earlier you mentioned that Eastern thinkers were really crazy for thinking of it as a piece of art, and I think now that we have the New Testament, we should be asking ourselves if we were crazy. Ephesians 2:10, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. We is Jew and Gentile, and
Yeah.
workmanship is literally poetry.
Yep.
We are his art.
Yep.
When we think of from a writer's perspective, like this is like there's no topping. There's just no topping. It is a piece of art.
Yeah.
Like we all like if we can all look at it like that, it's like a breath of fresh air.
Yep. And I've appreciated, and the responses I've gotten the last 3 weeks from this class have been mixed, because there are some who we've only looked at it from this Western standpoint, and there are some. I had one, actually, she's not here today, but it was an older lady who came to me in tears. I've been a Christian my whole life. I grew up in the church. And she said, I am seeing things from this perspective in ways I've never seen. I have struggled to understand the Bible my whole life. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing some things in a way I've never seen it before. And she was in tears. And I was kind of shocked. I was like, I was not expecting that kind of a reaction from anybody. And then I have the journalist and those that love literature, and there are several of you who's just like, oh, this is amazing. I love this. This is great. And then there's some that are just like, really? Is this really legit? Because my brain just isn't going there. And that's okay. Because, and I think maybe this is something that we have needed to do for a long time, because of the way that God designed this, to realize that we all think differently and we see things. Some of us see in pictures. I'm a picture person. I see pictures. That's why I got so excited, and I was like, I want to teach this. Because I'm one of those that I see this and I'm just going, oh, there's a whole different picture that's being painted here. and then there's others who's like, yeah, I like it better when I just say, I know 7 days were literal 24-hour 7 days, because God uses the word yom for day, and yom in the Hebrew language only means 24-hour days when it's connected with a number, and it has to be literal 24-hour days, because God created the plants on day 3. He didn't create the sun until day 4. How did all those plants live for millions of years if those days were millions of years? The Christian evidences part of us goes, I like to look at it that way with all the evidence. And I do too. I love that too. But there's another side to this. There's a different picture that's being painted that a lot of times we don't look at. And so we're going to continue as we walk through Genesis to open up that picture and see what was God doing with the text in a different way. And hopefully you'll get as much out of it as I did.